You better not go far away. What if there's a glitch?
Hello, everyone. Today's online roundtable guest is Cynthia Davidson. Cynthia Davidson is Executive Director of the nonprofit Anyone Cooperation Architecture think tank in New York City and editor of the International Architecture Journal Law. Any responsible for more than 40 books in print and oversees the Writing Architecture series published with MIT Press. She co-curated the US Pavilion at the 2016 Venice Architecture Biennale. She started the pop-up architecture gallery N-Space in 2017 and has hosted a number of cross-cultural, multidisciplinary conferences on architecture at venues around the globe. Occasionally, she writes for periodicals that began with the letter A, including Architectural Records, Art Forum, Architectura Viva, AA Files, and Abitare. She was recognized by the American Academy of Arts and Letters with its Architecture Award in 2014, and is a former Loeb Fellow at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. I want to start up the discussion by asking you a question. What is your general opinions and impressions about this year's Biennale?
Well, it's very difficult to talk about a Biennale when there are Biennales periodically. If we want to just talk about Venice, I've been to, I don't know, a half a dozen Biennales, perhaps. The first one in 1991. And I was one of the Lion jurors in 1996 when Hans Hollein was the director of the Biennale. So I've experienced the Biennale from different aspects, including, as you mentioned, when I co-curated the US Pavilion 2 years ago, which was a wonderful experience. Both working with the Biennale organization and with the Americans that we showed in the pavilion. I thought it was very important that Paolo Baratta, the president of the Biennale, appointed women architects to direct the Biennale this year. I know the work of Grafton Architects. I do not know the individuals themselves. I've never spoken with them, but I don't feel that the Biennale that they put together has much energy. And I look to Venice for energy. I look to Venice for ideas that can catapult new thinking, new ways of thinking about architecture, conceptualizing architecture, building architecture. I feel that there really wasn't anything catalytic, shall we say, that I recall seeing in May. I was present at the Vernissage. I would have to say I did not see everything in the Biennale. It's impossible to do at the Vernissage when the weekend turns out to be more about who you talk to than what you look at, which is a critically important aspect, I think, of the Biennale. Who comes, who you meet in the Giardini or in the Arsenale, and who you talk with. For example, when I came that weekend to the Turkish Pavilion, and saw old friends like Suha Özkan. That's one of the great things about the Biennale, is when you run into people that you either know or know about, and have a chance to engage them in conversation. So in that sense, every Biennale that I've attended, I believe, is a success, at least that opening weekend. Because of the interchanges that are set up. Obviously, living in New York, I can't attend the different discussions that Yvonne and Shelley have put on in the course of the Biennale. and perhaps some of those have generated the very ideas that I find missing, largely missing in the exhibitions themselves.
I would like to ask a question. During the year you have co-curated the U.S. Pavilion in Venice, well, you had started working quite before Aravena was named, and yet your handling of the theme of the U.S. Pavilion somehow managed to address the general theme of the Biennale. The 13th Vardia, us, also had well, a great amount of debate about how much a certain national pavilion should be expected to be coherent with the general theme of the Biennale. What is your position on this matter? Like, should the national pavilions all be coherent with the theme, or at least like relate to it somehow, or maybe conceptualize their handling after they have started curating? What is your position?
Well, I think the model of that is the 2014 Biennale that Rem Koolhaas did, when he talked about the fundamentals of architecture within the exhibition that he curated, but that the mandate, literally a mandate, that he gave all of the national pavilions to look at the role of modernism in architecture, proved in the end to be quite powerful. I say that, I think, in retrospect, because I'm not sure I fully understood that when I was there. And in fact, it's only Aravena's and now Shelley and Yvonne's biennales that, in retrospect, Rem's mandate, I think, was quite strong. It made for a very strong biennale and something you could react to. The individuality of the national pavilions can be quite rich, but also seeing what happened when nearly all of them abided by Rem's mandate, you had a sweeping view of modernity around the globe and what that produced and when it occurred, that in hindsight, I think, was quite successful. The Architectural Imagination exhibition that Monica Ponce de Leon and I did was actually our third attempt to, our third proposal to the US Department of State to do an exhibition that centered on the problem of Detroit. We had especially thought that for Rem's Biennale in particular, that modernism in the United States, you could make a very strong argument that Detroit was one of the key centers, if only because of the development of the automobile and the technology that involved, and how it changed not only the American city and suburb, but the world, and how we occupy and move about the world. That itself was a globally sweeping modern invention. We weren't successful in being awarded the pavilion that year, but we came back again, kind of reconfiguring the proposal to focus more on neighborhoods, sites in Detroit that needed some kind of remediation, and selecting architects through a national competition of expressions of interest who would take on these sites that Monica and I selected in Detroit. It is sheer accident that Aravena's reporting from the front had some parallels with what we did. And in fact, if you saw some of the criticism that was leveled at what we did, Many people did not read the text on the walls, and some people said there was too much text, and they're probably right. People, when you go to the Biennale and there's so much to see, you're not going to read all that text. That they walked in and they saw the high level of design and said, this is top-down architecture that doesn't care about the status quo, that doesn't care about the needs of the people. And therefore it's bad because that's not what we do today. Whereas Monica and I felt very strongly that architects have an important role to play, that they bring a certain expertise, a certain design expertise to any problem. And of course, we had them all go to Detroit, all visit the sites that we selected with advisors from the city of Detroit, to meet with community members, to talk to them about the issues that were at hand. And when we brought the show back to Detroit after Venice, we were told that our exhibition had single-handedly changed the conversation about the future of Detroit in the city itself. We didn't set out to do that. We simply set out to introduce the population to a kind of vocabulary they don't usually have access to, so that they could talk to people who are clearly, and we see it already happening, clearly going to revive Detroit, make changes in Detroit, both urbanistically and architecturally, and that we gave them tools, vocabulary to participate in that conversation. And we brought all the projects to Detroit, and the architects presented them to the community groups that they had all worked with prior to Venice, and had really interesting conversations about their responses to the projects. One group was quite concerned, for example, that they had asked for a fountain and didn't get a fountain in one of the projects. But I don't think, it's not a top-down project, but it does use architects' expertise to make suggestions as to what possibilities were. And by having 3 architects working on each site, the public was able to see that there are always multiple directions that one can go when thinking about how to develop the city and how to build buildings.
Well, having seen your exhibition about Detroit, I was going to open up that subject, but you acted before me. Since I suppose there were about 12 teams of architects that you have brought to Detroit. Not all of them were very familiar with the city itself. Not that they have to, but in this sense, they have somehow managed to engage in a dialogue with the people who live in Detroit. In this sense, I believe while talking about participatory design, I believe the matter should be addressed with the question how as well. What were the methods that the architects used to engage with the communities? What did they do? And which were the ones that have satisfactorily worked out for them? Like what did work or maybe what did not work to engage with the community?
Well, I think participatory design is a problematic idea, because I think it does take expertise in order to execute a successful design. I can take an example. For example, I live in a cooperative apartment complex in New York City. A cooperative means that each apartment owner also owns a part of the building, is responsible for the overall well-being of the building. And there's a board of directors for these cooperatives who are supposed to oversee the financial matters. The board of directors is residents who are elected to be on the board. They are intended to oversee financial matters, maintenance of the physical building, and so forth. But then someone will say, well, I don't like that, or I want lights fixed here, or I want that. We can never satisfy all the residents because each person has an individual desire or need or idea or taste, and they have to accept that they're part of a community. So what is participatory design? Where do you draw the line? In any community, there are always community leaders, people who rise to the top because they're extroverted personalities, say, or they believe they have a certain expertise, or they may have a financial interest, or they may even be a local politician. Are they really representing the entire community? Where does the idea of what the community wants, where do you draw that line? And what does it mean for the architect to do participatory design? I don't think they do design with the community. I believe this is where the architect's expertise comes in. So what we asked our 12 teams of architects to do was, we had 4 sites, 3 architects per site. 1 week, we visited the site in on the DeQuinder Cut, for example, a old rail line that's now been turned into a pedestrian and bicycle path through the landscape of Detroit. And there was a large site for development there that the city thought it was really important our architects pay attention to before the developer actually executes a project. Meaning, what were the possibilities that one could show the community so the community could then put pressure on the actual developer of the site? None of the things we were commissioned were ever intended to be built. They were intended to be ideas, displays of imagination, which is both an architectural imagination, but also was meant to stimulate the public imagination. What would they then think of doing? That doesn't mean they're designing. So I wouldn't call that participatory design. So the participation was the architects coming to the sites, meeting stakeholders in the site, meeting neighbors to the site, talking to people who had businesses in the area. There in the DeQuinder Cut site, there was no residential fabric because it's all been torn down. So there weren't residents one could consult. And to ask them, what did they think should happen there? What did they need? What did they envision? But not about what should it look like? What should the design be? What should the material be? They have no clue. Honestly, they have no clue. And as architects, you have to understand, you have to educate the client. And the only way you can educate the client, which is also the community, is by presenting them with proposals, presenting them with ideas, and using your expertise to do that after listening to them tell you what they hope might be possible on these particular sites. So for me, the participation comes before the design. It's not participatory design itself. I have a problem with that term.
I see. Thank you for your insight. I believe there would be some more of us amongst us who would like to raise questions to you.
Hello. Actually, I would like to ask you about Anyone Corporation.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. I can. I lost your picture, but I can hear you. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Perfect. I would like to ask you about Anyone Corporation. The works of this think tank is very inspiring in terms of their publications, conferences, seminars, and exhibitions. And I would like to ask you, how did you establish this community, I mean, this corporation, and how was the creative process behind it? How did you come up with it?
Well, I personally did not come up with it. I made it happen. The concept was the idea of 3 architect theorists, Arata Izozaki in Tokyo, Peter Eisenman in New York, and Ignazi de Sola Morales in Barcelona. They had this idea that it'd be nice to do a conference in the 90s leading up to the millennium about the undecidability of architecture at that time. This, of course, kind of moving out of the deconstruction, the philosophy of deconstruction, and the writing of Jacques Derrida, and perhaps moving more towards the ideas that were being proposed by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. I met Peter in Chicago. I was editing an architecture magazine there, and he thought that I had the background and track record that would make me a good director to run this project. So we went to Tokyo, and I met Isozaki there. And Isozaki raised the money to fund 10 conferences in the 10 years leading up to the year 2000 that would meet in a different city every spring and would be framed by the 10 any words, they're compound words, in the English language dictionary today. Anyone, anywhere, anytime, any place, anything, and so forth. And the first conference was done in 1991 in Los Angeles at the Getty Center, co-sponsored by the Getty, and Kurt Forrester was then director of the architecture program at the Getty. And the conferences were conceived of as sort of 2.5-day events in which architecture would host people both within and without the discipline. So at the first event, for example, Jacques Derrida was president. Roberto Mangabeira Unger was there, then teaching law at Harvard, but a Brazilian who has since gone back to Brazil and been finance minister of Brazil in the government there. Kojin Karatani, a comparative literature theorist in Japan. Rosalind Krauss, the art historian, and any number of architects, Isozaki, Peter, Rem Koolhaas, etc. About 25 people. The science fiction author, William Gibson, was there. The philosopher of religion, Mark Taylor, was there. People were invited because architectural thinking was clearly part of their work, or their work was reacting to architecture. Frederick Jameson was there. And of course, he's written a lot about John Portman's work and other architects. These were meant to be exploratory conferences, talking about ideas, talking about thinking, talking about concepts, not talking about product. The directors of the corporation, which also included Phyllis Lambert in Montreal, agreed that they would be responsible for co-hosting hosting literally the first 4 conferences. So the second was Isozaki's responsibility in Japan. The third was Sola Morales' responsibility in Barcelona. And the fourth was Phyllis Lambert's responsibility in Montreal. By that time, we were receiving proposals from other architectural institutions and groups around the world, almost a kind of mini Olympics, shall we say. There were architects asking to bring the conference to their city. So we went to Seoul in 95. We went to Buenos Aires in 96, Rotterdam in 97. We were in Ankara, Turkey in 98, Paris in 99, and we finished in New York in the year 2000 with under the umbrella of the word anything, which, as you can imagine, if you know the cliche, anything goes. Meaning anything can happen and anything goes off stage. It's gone. Each year, we produced a book documenting the papers that each participant was required to give, as well as edited transcripts of the conversations that were held. The format was 3 or 4 person panels who each gave a 20-minute talk, and then they talked among each other and answered audience questions. I will say this, and this is not because you all are from Turkey and are in the Turkish pavilion at Venice today, but the event in Ankara was quite lively because the subject was any time. And any time was a term that many people had wanted to have for their event. And we had held on to that concept because we felt when the moment was right or the time was right or the host organization and city were right, that time would be a critical topic to be discussing. And we did any time in Ankara, in part because of the depth in time of civilization in that part of the world. It was also as I remember, not all that welcome to have so many of us talking in Ankara. There were people in the audience who felt we had come to tell them what they should be doing in architecture, which of course was not the point at all. But I still remember, I can't remember the title of the book I read now, about, I wish I could remember the title. Anyway, I wrote my introduction to the book Anytime about the introduction of the clock by the Austrians to the Ottoman Empire, and how that completely changed Ottoman life, and how one could almost link this idea of artificial time imposed by the clock rather than the sunrise and sunset to the beginning of the fall of the Ottoman Empire. It's a very provocative book. If I think of the title, I will send it to you. Erdem's looking it up. Lords of the Horizons. Yeah. Have you read it?
I haven't. I
suppose. As an outsider, I found it a very fascinating interpretation of time. In addition to doing the 10 conferences, and the participants changed every time. The hosts would name half the participants, and then we would do the other half of the participants. Izozaki, Eisenman, and Sola Morales, Fred Jameson, John Reichman were usually there to have some sort of continuity between events. But we also began inviting younger architects, Alejandro Zaira Polo, Liz Dillard, Greg Lynn, to join this group, so that the participants themselves changed over time. But one way to expand the project itself was to start Any Magazine in 1993, which was a magazine not recording what was happening, which I had been doing with the magazine I edited in Chicago, but rather to activate discussion so that each issue was thematic, each issue had a guest editor. Many of the issues were records of a one-day, half-day, 6-person event we would have in New York to discuss an idea. In 1993 or 4, we did an event with Mark Taylor. He coined the term electrotexture in order to talk about the coming issue of virtual space. At that time, there were things called chat rooms on the web. People were meeting in these rooms by typing on the keyboard their ideas, sharing their ideas through typing in these chat rooms. They weren't seeing each other like we're seeing each other now. And he was very early as a philosopher to start thinking about what that meant about physical space and how virtual space would affect the practice of architecture and how architects would imagine physical space going forward. We did Any Magazine until the year 2000 when we had the last conference. And we also started a series of books with MIT Press called Writing Architecture, which are paperback originals written by an individual, many of whom had participated in the conferences or the magazine over the years. And the Writing Architecture series continues. And obviously, you mentioned Log. In 2003, we published the first issue of Log. And we do occasional exhibitions and occasional talks, including book launches when we publish a book. But it's still very much, one could say, a theoretical project in the United States that doesn't get you much traction in terms of funding, because the United States is a very pragmatic country, likes to make products, that it likes to invest in the making of product that it can then sell. The Japanese culture, on the other hand, which funded the first 10 years, is very invested in thinking and ideas. And other countries that where organizations would help to fund the Anyone Project in those first 10 years, the important funding came from outside of the United States, not from the United States itself. Is that enough of an answer for your question?
Thank you. It was really interesting to hear the story, the process from you. We have more questions for you.
Okay.
Hello. I want to shift the topic to your lecture about editing versus creating, a School of Architecture, which was very inspiring for us. And regarding that, could you please elaborate more on the visibility of the curatorial and the editorial processes?
Well, I probably work as a curator more like an editor, but I do think they're different. And the popularity of curation and curating, and the idea that everything is curated, whether it's on a store shelf, in a museum, on a table in a restaurant, is very funny to me. In my work as an editor, I believe I am shaping writing, even teaching writing in some instances. For me, a curator recognizes work that is done and brings it to public view, or puts it together with some other work that is completed and brings it to public view. I think as an editor, we do much more to solicit ideas, to ask people to write. For example, in the current issue of Log now at the printer, I asked several people if they would take stock of the last 15 years of reconstruction of the World Trade Center site, because this is the 15th anniversary of Log 44, which of course began as a reaction in part to the images of the World Trade Center design competition in 2002. So that there's the idea of shaping something, of putting something together that's not yet cooked. And the writing that I get, say one of you submits an article, we would read it and we would say, oh, there's an idea here, but it's not well developed, or this grammar needs some work, or whatever. I think editors are much more involved in shaping than in displaying. Now, that's not to say that curators don't shape. They formulate ideas, they find work, or the work suggests to them ideas, and they can then create an exhibition. For example, I just saw an exhibition at the Prada Foundation in Venice called, if you haven't seen it, you should, the Machines à Penser, about Heidegger, Wittgenstein, and Adorno, and their rural retreats or their huts. And this to me is it's a very interesting concept. And there are a couple of things that the curator had done that were made for the exhibition. But largely, he just acquired work that's already finished and put it together for us to view in a new way. I think an editor is much more involved in shaping that work before presenting it to be read in a new way. And that's probably seen in how we did the US Pavilion, because we took the risk of commissioning all new work, which is a little bit like the risk I take with Issues of Log when I commission a writer to do a piece. I may get a piece that's not what I wanted, or that's not very good, or that's fantastic, is more than I expected. But it's easier to control that than it is to control the development of an object such as we exhibited in the pavilion. So I think that for a curator who's working to create an exhibition, you take a lot more risks when you work more like an editor and commission work that you don't know what you're going to really see in the end.
Thank you for the answer. And are there any more questions?
Well, having mentioned about the log journal, it is like it has been a very special piece of intellectual writing during my architectural education, and it is very appreciable in the sense that it has somehow protected consistency of format. As far as I'm concerned, log journals, even the first year's issues are very similar in format to the last ones, like the page structure and how the writings are structured, etc. How do you interpret this, the medium in the sense of the discussion?
Wait a minute, I didn't hear, it broke up. How do I what? What?
I didn't
how do
hear
you hear you?
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Could you articulate on the format of editors, like a journal's format? What I was trying to say is that the log journal has remained very consistent in its format, which is appreciable. Is that intentional, or was that how things rolled on? Like, what is your position on the medium itself being consistent? Like, because several journals changed the way they structure the pieces, the format of the journal, the amount of images that go in, the length of the text, etc.
Okay. I can answer that. You would have to have seen any magazine to understand in part why Log looks the way it looks. Any magazine was tabloid size, so it was oversized, big. You can't see my hands on the screen, can you? Like a tabloid newspaper. And it was printed in 2 colors. And when we switched from the graphic designer Massimo Vignelli to Michael Rock and Susan Sellers before they became 2x4, the graphics almost dominated the magazine. And occasionally we had complaints that the texts were illegible because of overlaid color or images or graphics, and that in many instances, because of the use of color, You could not Xerox an article and pass it around. I thought that actually was very funny because, of course, we wanted to sell the magazine, not have people copying it. But it was unintentional. But it's quite beautiful. If you see any of them, the 2x4 designs of any are now in the design collection at the Museum of Modern Art as design objects, not necessarily as artifacts or records of thought in the 90s in architecture. When I decided to do log, I wanted to do the exact opposite. As I mentioned, there had been a design competition at the World Trade Center site with 7 teams presenting, all of whom were required to build models, but also to present renderings of what their proposal would look like if built, this sort of reality rendering that's so common now. And they were all very beautiful and very seductive, and it's all really people really focused on. They, in the discussion in the press and in the general press and on the street and even in architecture, was like, look at that image, look at that rendering, look at that skyline. And there was very little discussion about architecture and the city and plan and so forth. I mean, obviously there were different stakeholders who had different interests in what should happen there, but I felt cheated with the level of discussion personally. And while doing any magazine had been personally rewarding, it was also done at great personal sacrifice, and I had stopped it because keeping it going financially was impossible. So I realized after the design competition and this discussion, or lack thereof, required a new magazine, but it should be a magazine that resisted the seductive power of the image, which meant it also resisted the seductive power of the graphics of any magazine, and that it should be like a literary magazine and should emphasize writing over image, should emphasize thinking in using words. This did not mean we didn't use images, but it meant we needed a quiet space like a literary magazine. And Log is actually modeled after a then young literary magazine in the United States called McSweeney's. It's the exact same size as the first issues of McSweeney's, which, by the way, has changed its format many times. But we have remained consistent. And Michael Beirut did a grid for us. Everything hangs from the top. Images are largely black and white. A few times we've done a color section for various reasons. But they've been of photographs, not renderings. We do like plans and sections and sketches and elevation drawings and historical drawings. So we're not image free. We're not without visual quality, but the whole thing is meant to be quite quiet. And this is also because today, when all of you have access to what I would call information about architecture online, whether it's ArchDaily or Architizer or World Architecture News or whatever, any number of things that also come into my email that I see all the time. I consider that fast space, and I'm not sure that we should be thinking fast in that sense about some of the issues that architecture must contend with. And that in contrast, the pages of Log are what I call slow space, that when you have an issue of the magazine in your hands and it's fairly quiet, there are not a lot of graphics jumping out at you. There's a white page with a black text, and maybe a black image, or maybe 2 pages of text, and then a page of a big drawing. That slow space gives you a chance to slow down and think about what you're reading, perhaps write something in the margins, use the paper as a notebook in itself, so that you're the one introducing something other to the magazine, and we're just conveying critical thinking. which I think is more than information. It's not just information. Information comes at you from all over the place at varying speeds, but blog looks the way it does in part because it's meant to be slow.
Thank you for your answer. Is there any other questions?
I hope not.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, for your insights. It has been a very delightful conversation for us. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me, and go to the Prada Foundation if you haven't been there yet.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.